Within the walls of the Tower of London is a beautiful Tudor chapel. However, it houses the executed remains of some of English history's most infamous and notorious people. Within the chapel is St. Peter and Vincula, or two of Henry VIII's wives, who both lost their heads a short distance away on the scaffold, and also another queen, Lady Jane Grey, is buried there. Many other people who were executed on Tower Hill and were also interred in the crypt, their headless remains being deposited inside the church. But as mentioned, the most notable burials include two wives of King Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Henry VIII's second and fifth wife both had very different fates inside of the Tower of London. Anne was allowed a sword to be used to take her head, but Catherine was forced to undergo the less reliable axe. But what happened to her? And her grave was shocking in the aftermath of her execution. Catherine Howard was the fifth wife of the notorious Tudor king, and her marriage to the king was one which was short-lived and a huge mistake from the start. Her uncle was Thomas Howard, who was a prominent member of the king's court, and he was the Duke of Norfolk, and through his loyal service to the king, Catherine Howard secured a place at court. Her uncle managed to get her a place inside of the household of Anne of Cleves, and the fourth wife of the king, but Henry VIII was known for hunting for new wives and mistresses inside of the households of his wives, and his eyes wandered towards the young Catherine Howard. Her family were rewarded with huge grants of land and wealth, and Henry was obsessed with the young girl, and he claimed that she was like no other woman that he had ever met. Catherine herself was given many different gifts and jewellery, and the king said she was the very jewel of womanhood, and many ambassadors described her as delightful. But she was a very young girl and was just a teenager, but the king was around 25 years older than her, at least. The king and Catherine married on the 28th of July 1540, on the same day that Thomas Cromwell, the king's former close friend and chief adviser, was executed on Tower Hill. Catherine was young and carefree, and she was way too young to be involved in matters of government. The newlyweds went on a honeymoon and Catherine got more reward. However, the downfall of Catherine Howard would come as soon as the marriage occurred. Catherine was herself enamoured with a male courtier, the king's favourite, Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a man who succeeded in the queen's affections over the king, and this was of course very dangerous, and they met a number of times in private, and they had a physical relationship, it's believed, behind Henry VIII's back. The pair conversed through love letters, and the adultery was facilitated by Jane Boleyn. But Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, investigated the rumours of infidelity, and he found a love letter written by Catherine for Culpeper. But the king was one day praying inside the Chapel Royal in Hampton Court Palace, and he was then told by Cranmer of the Queen's adultery. She was then stripped of her title as Queen, and was quickly then sent towards the Tower of London after being confined to her chambers. In the meantime, Thomas Culpeper and another man named Francis Derham, who it was claimed may have had a pre-contract of marriage with Catherine Howard, and this would have invalidated the king's marriage, which of course was very serious. Because of these actions, Culpeper and Derham were executed, and their heads were placed above London Bridge on a pike. And it's said that Catherine even passed under the heads of her former lovers as she made her way to the Tower of London. She was taken through Traitor's Gate into the Tower, and quickly arrangements for her execution took place. The Queen's execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542. That evening before, she practised laying her head upon the executioner's block to make sure she could do it in such a way that the axeman would only take one swing. The next morning, the young teenage girl was terrified as she made her way to the execution scaffold, and she walked out onto Tower Green. It was said on the scaffold that she deserved to die, 1,000 deaths for her betrayal of the king, but what happened following her execution was something Catherine certainly did not deserve. The executioner took her head clean off with just one swing of the axe, and Catherine, it's believed, was not buried inside of a coffin and was just thrown in a roughly dug grave inside of the Tower of London's chapel, the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, right next to where the executioner's scaffold was. Her body would have been collected, along with her head, and then taken into the chapel, and because of the hastily arranged execution, there were little preparations made for Catherine's burial. Compared with the execution of Henry VIII's other wife, Anne Boleyn, Anne was given a French swordsman for the execution, and this was seen as a kind thing for Henry VIII to arrange, as a sword was more reliable than the executioner using the commoner's axe. Anne's scaffold was also covered in black, expensive velvet and fabric, denoting her status as a queen, but Catherine Howard's scaffold was just covered in hay, like a stable, to soak up the blood, and she was not even given a cushion to kneel upon, and Catherine did not die a queen. Her ladies-in-waiting covered her body in black cloth and carried it into the chapel to bury her, and there was no ceremony at all, and no chest for her to be buried inside of. Catherine was given no funeral, and then everyone left, but the officials of the Tower of London. It was said that when she was buried and wrapped in the cloth in the ground, that a rather significant and liberal amount of quicklime was shovelled into her grave, and it was said that Henry VIII had ordered this treatment. This meant that the effects of the quicklime led to the body of Catherine decaying and dissolving quickly, and pretty much disappearing the face of the earth, as if she had never even existed. It was as though Catherine Howard had never even set foot on the planet. But when the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was renovated during the Victorian period, there was a lot of improvement made to the chapel, and with this the floor was lifted up. The builders dug up the bodies of those who were interred near to the altar, and the royal doctors identified the body of Anne Boleyn and many other executed figures, including Margaret Pole and also Jane Boleyn, who had aided Catherine Howard's infidelity, and she was executed straight after Catherine, so it would have been presumed that she would have been buried right next to her. The remains of these significant people were then identified and were placed into new coffins, and then moved whilst the building work was finished. But the remains of Catherine Howard could not be found, and it's believed that she was very close to the high altar, and this was because of her status. But Catherine's body was not found, and this does allude to the fact she was covered in quicklime following her burial. Close to where Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was found, there was said to have been a small collection of bones that had been strongly eroded by lime, but these could not have been significantly linked to Catherine. Her body was not one of these which was identified during the excavations, unlike those such as Thomas More, John Fisher, and many others. Still to this day, the remains and body of Catherine Howard have not been found, and inside of the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to her cousin Anne Boleyn's body, is a memorial stone for Catherine Howard, but her body is not underneath. The chemical of quicklime would have sped up the decomposition of her body, and it's also believed that Catherine's young age would not have helped the process, as her bones had not fully hardened or formed, because she was just a teenager. But she was just a young girl when she married the horrific Henry VIII. But in the form of Thomas Culpeper, she met a man whom she had much more in common with than her husband, who was by this time grotesque and huge. But there has been some debate as to whether the remains that were identified of Anne Boleyn could have been Catherine. But without any form of DNA testing, this could not be put to bed. Catherine Howard had a rough and devastating life that came to an end inside the Tower of London. She was possibly the most tragic of the notorious Tudor king's wives, but the treatment of her remains after execution were brutal, and she was dissolved off the face of the earth and was left to rot. But Henry VIII wanted this to be done quickly. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.